It's a total logical thing to think to do.
But ultimately, it was at that point that her life and the life of so many others would change dramatically forevermore.
Just a quick disclaimer, the content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, crime scenes and other disturbing material. Listener discretion is advised. This episode is sponsored by Think Forensic.
Think Forensic are a one-stop shop for all things forensic science and crime solving. They hold experience days, as well as corporate events, team building events, and general education for primary school right the way up to university level, as well as other events and consultancy. There's also a shop where you can get your hands on all things crime solving, from evidence gathering to packaging and collecting evidence, as well as other forensic science equipment.
For more information or to book on an experience day, please visit the website.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Grave Secrets. We're your hosts. I'm Beth.
And I'm Annie, and today we are covering one of the cases that I still think is probably one of the most shocking cases in British history.
Yeah, it's shocking, obviously horrific.
Yeah.
But also, I would say arguably one of the most well-known ones in terms of UK history.
Yeah, so today we're going to be covering the case of James Bulger, and he got abducted and unfortunately he was murdered, and it was like so soon before his third birthday.
Yeah, so an innocent 2-year-old little boy. So it's particularly hard hitting, this one. We appreciate if this is not the one for you.
Yeah.
Obviously it's the murder of a child, but what makes it even more unfathomable is that the offenders in this case were both under the age of 16. Yeah, again, making it incredibly.
I just feel like this could have happened to anyone.
Yeah.
Because it was an opportunist as well, weren't it? It was like just an opportunity
Absolutely.
that they took, and that could have been anyone in that shopping centre. And to murder a little boy just a month before his third birthday.
I just, when it's one of these where you think about what you'd be going through at that time kind of thing, just in general, having a 2-year-old nearly turning 3.
Yeah.
The last thing on your mind would ever be that you're about to lose your child.
No.
You're literally planning their third birthday.
It doesn't even bear thinking about, does
it?
I
guess when you are an older parent, maybe if you're in your 80s, there are unfortunately circumstances when parents do lose their children, but usually that's something that happens when their child is maybe like 40s, 50s, they have a heart attack. It's something where they die of natural causes.
And you always expect to outlive your child, don't you? Yeah.
So yes, you might unfortunately have that scenario happen to you if you're like late 80s as a parent.
Yeah,
but you
not
don't
like this young.
expect it to happen when you've got a toddler.
Yeah, sorry, not the parent to outlive. You expect the child to outlive
the parent.
The parent, don't you? So you never think as a parent you would have to deal with that. So yeah, it is a really, really sad and horrific case in particular, isn't it? So we are back today after we've had a week off as well.
Yeah, we say a week off like it was nice and glamorous.
It wasn't.
It was the worst week I've had, probably, in probably the year.
Yeah.
I felt absolutely horrific. I felt awful, but then that really makes my mental health dip big time. So I've just had a nightmare week. And then I, unfortunately, before the real nightmare week, we were working flat out like 9 days in a row. And I unfortunately gave Annie the lurg also.
So Beth had it first, then we worked together at the Royal Armouries. Then I thought, the next day I was like, oh, my throat's a bit. And I thought, And then one day when Beth wasn't working with me, I found some tablets, didn't I? Some cold and flu tablets. And I was like, please, can I take these?
And then I was like, oh no.
Yeah, and then I got it. And then you seemed to get it even worse, didn't you? And then we've been in the car down to London, and I was thinking, please, no, don't give it me back again. Please don't give me this back again, because it was horrendous.
Yeah.
I felt like I was just swallowing razor blades. I know. And there's no way we could have spoke for 2 hours.
We literally, I did because again, I get the illness guilt. So I was feeling bad about the fact that I was letting people down. I literally tried to do like a 1 minute long voice note to you to say, I'm really sorry, but I don't think I can do it. And I couldn't even get through that without coughing. So I was like, just like, you know, and you have to like think about it logically.
Yeah.
Like if I can't get through a minute, there's no way we can record two episodes.
There has been some episodes before where we've both been feeling a bit ropey.
Yeah.
And I've had to cut out loads of coughs, but it's been from one or the other.
Yeah.
Whereas both of us, like, it would have been absolutely shocking. I think even if we'd have done 30-minute episodes, I couldn't even have hacked that.
No, it was just the right choice. And these things happen, don't they?
And we are normally quite organised, and we normally have a few, like, in the bank, don't we, ready to post. But unfortunately, we'd been working that much the week before and the week before that. We were just flat out, weren't we?
Yeah,
and that's another thing. It's probably been run down as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
So we're back with a vengeance. I still sound a bit ropey, I reckon, but you'll have to deal with it.
Yeah, not as bad as you did the other day.
No.
So
we're better.
We're all right, we're getting there.
Okay, so enough about us. Obviously, we're here to talk about something much more serious than our little blip. If we start it again chronologically, this case took place on the 12th of February, 1993. And this is another element that I found interesting because I wasn't even born when this case took place, but I knew this case already really well.
Yeah.
Just from the amount of
publicity
about it.
Yeah, I didn't actually know a lot about this one, but it was through choice.
Okay.
So I was born then, so I was born 89, but this is the year that my sister was born.
Right.
So thinking back to it, I was like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Just always when I've been a bit younger and looking at case studies, it's not something that I particularly thought I want to learn about. Obviously, I'd heard about it.
Yeah.
I just didn't want to know
any
of the details behind it. So for me, this was a pretty, not a new case, but when I was looking a bit more in depth into it, I was finding out new stuff that I was like, oh my God, I can't believe this was,
that it's real, really.
Yeah. It doesn't seem real. That's the thing. It does seem like an episode or something. Yeah.
So again, we will talk through the abduction because that's ultimately what it was. But just like Annie said about some of the details, when it comes to the actual murder of James Bulger, we aren't going to talk about all of the details.
No.
Because I just don't think there's any need. I mean, it's horrific. We will talk around the detail, obviously, because it's significant. But in terms of the amount of injury,
the specific injuries we're not going to talk about.
You can have a look at that yourself if you're so inclined, but I don't think it gives anything in terms of remembering James.
No, it doesn't. So Denise Bulger was James's mom. They lived in Kirk Bay in Liverpool, and I think they lived in like a flat, didn't they, that was near to some other of the relatives. So she said it was quite near, I think, to Denise's mom. Yeah,
she lived with like her little family, but then she'd also got a brother. And on this day, so on the 12th of Feb, it was actually Denise's brother's girlfriend.
Yeah, that came round.
That had asked, basically just said, I'm going to the local shopping centre. It wasn't a huge shopping centre. She said, I'm not going to be there long. I need to just take something back. But do you fancy the trip out?
I think it was the only one in the area. So if you did want to go and do it, go and like do any shopping or anything, that would be where you went. And I sort of, when I had a look into it and I was looking at some of the CCTV stuff of the shopping centre, it looked a little bit similar to like White Rose.
Yeah.
So not like a Meadow Hall where it's like huge. It was more like a smaller.
Yeah, we're
getting. If you're up north,
so I'm going to say we're getting
Rose,
super specific there, but effectively, you've got like, to me, you've got the shopping centres that are a bit like a real retail park, but inside. So smaller scale, and then you've got the big, huge shopping centres where sometimes you're literally like, do I need a map? And they've kind of got different bits that jut off. I don't think it was that huge.
No.
Although we did say there is reference that we'll come to about the amount of different stores there were.
Yeah.
But it wasn't huge. It was just literally the local shopping centre.
Yeah.
So she said, yeah, sure. And she thought her and James, her son, could just pop out for a couple of hours. But she did say that it was really cold out on that day, which generally, if I can get my words, generally is the case in Britain.
February.
Yeah, well, I mean, I from about September till February, it's just quite cold. And so at this stage, she said that she had to bundle James up in like hat, gloves, the full works, because it was so cold. But had decided that because they wouldn't be out for very long, she wasn't going to actually put him in the pushchair, in the pram.
She said, though, didn't she, like, looking back, that was the only time that she didn't take the pram with her. Normally, she would have took the pram, but she thought, oh, we're just nipping in and out, so he'll be all right to walk with me.
Yeah, and it's one of those where if you're going shopping for lots of things, a pram's just useful to have because you can shove everything in it or on it. Or, but I guess if they were just going for a mooch around, as we say, then you'd think, well, I'll just not bother.
Yeah. But when I looked at some interviews with Denise, and she said if that was the one thing that she wished she would have done was to that day have taken the pram, and then this wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, because again, people might be thinking like, well, what's the pram? What's the significance of the pram? But again, you've got a toddler, so James was just just 2 years old.
She said he was
lively.
So if
he was in the pram, in the pushchair, he wouldn't have had chance to be taken because she'd have literally been holding the pram.
Yeah.
Whereas obviously, if he is just holding a hand, it's a lot easier for him to slip away.
Yeah. The Strand shopping centre where they went is in Bootle, and it did look a little bit sort of run down, like maybe not run down, maybe a little bit of one of the older shopping centres. It weren't like brand new or
the kind of shopping centre that I now take photos of.
Yeah. Yes.
In my spare time. So it was in Sefton in Merseyside, but Bootle was like the specific town that it was within. And again, they literally weren't in there for very long. At about 1:45, they were actually on their way out of the shopping centre. They'd done what they needed to do, and then they decided to, again, so shopping centre all on the inside, but then on the outside of the shopping centre, there's like the strip of shops almost that it's a bit more like a high street, I guess. Like
so the shops on the outside and the shops on the inside, isn't there? Yeah.
And so one of the shops upon exit was the local butcher's. And again, there were other shops along there. So there was a betting shop, I believe, one of these like banking, what do you call them when they're not a bank? They're a building society. Things like that along the front. So she thought, right, well, while I'm here, I can get some meat for tea. So that's exactly what they did. And it was that decision ultimately, not that it was a bad decision, but it was that ultimately played a part in
something you wouldn't even think about though doing, would you? You think, obviously Denise thought, oh, I've got tea to cook tonight, I'm passing the butcher's, I'll call in and get this meat, that'll be tea sorted, I'll not have to go out of the house again. It's a total logical thing to think to do.
But ultimately, it was at that point that her life and the life of so many others would change dramatically forevermore.
Yeah.
And she so she ordered at the butcher's, and literally as she was paying, she let go of James's hand that split second to get her purse out, and that is when, that's all it took for him to disappear.
Yeah. You think though, when you let go for a split second and then she turned around, it must have been within seconds that she realised that James wasn't there. You just think, obviously it's going to be panic, but he can't be far away because it's been a few seconds.
Yeah.
So you can run probably faster than a toddler. So you'd be looking in everything that was close to where he'd gone, wouldn't you?
And quite often they just get distracted by something nearby. And like you referenced, Denise said that James was active. He was a boisterous little boy.
Yeah.
He was always trying to make people laugh. So again, whether or not he'd have seen someone else
and like smiled or started
being silly. And again, running round. He had really blonde hair, didn't he? So
yeah.
Again, when you see pictures of him and stuff, he was like a really cute 2-year-old.
She said, didn't she, Denise, that on like all the videos that they had of James, all you could see is like blonde hair just bouncing around the room.
Yeah.
Like blonde curly hair, and he'd always be like running past the camera.
Yeah. So again, at this stage, you have that initial panic when you look back
Yeah.
But she probably didn't think all that much about it. But then quite quickly, when she'd left the butcher's, still couldn't see him. Obviously, we're now on the outside of the shopping centre, so there is the road nearby.
Yeah, there's
It's
a lot
less
of different things
contained.
that can...
She then obviously began to worry. And one of her first port of call, which makes complete sense again, was to go on, you know, those little like toy rides that you get in shopping centres where you put 50p in and you might like, it's like a fake, what's this called? Carousel horse.
Yeah, they move up and down, because she said he loved going on those. So she thought, out of everywhere in the shopping centre, where would he have gone
or
to?
the Thomas the Tank one. And
Yeah. So she'd actually gone there to look for him, and she'd asked like the person in the shop that was nearest, because they're outside shops, aren't they? They're not manned. It's not like a manned ride. You just put £1 in it and sit on it and it goes up and down. So I think she'd asked some people around there and no one had seen him, and she ended up going to the reception, which obviously you would do, and getting it put out over the tannoy. And I was thinking about this because in one of the shopping centres up here in Meadowhall, they used to have, I don't think they've still got it anymore in there, but they used to have the statues.
Yes.
So they had the statues and they were on Market Street.
Yeah.
Like, it's not a street because obviously it's inside the shopping centre. But if anyone went missing, or when you were in Meadowhall, my mum always used to say like, oh, if you lose me or something happens, you know, these are the statues.
Go there.
And you go to the statues, and then I always used to hear over the tannoy, if anyone's lost a child, go to the statues on Market Street.
That's a real throwback, actually, because I don't think, do they even have a tannoy anymore? I can't think.
No, but I used to hear that all the time in Meadowhall when I was younger, and I used to think, oh, someone's gone missing. But obviously it wasn't. It just somewhat like a child had wandered off. And when Denise actually reported this to reception, they thought that is what it would be. Because in these instances, they do get reports of missing children all the time in the shopping centre. But the officer of the shopping centre said, by the time I finish filling in the paperwork, they've normally found the child. So it's not like it's usually a full search. They're normally just around the corner, or
and
they've
again,
hidden.
if a child goes missing in a shop, because this happened to one of my friends, she went missing in a shop. So it was in Marks and Spencer's, which generally are quite big shops, but they just put the shutters down on the Marks and Spencer's so that they knew that she was within
leave.
there somewhere, which is obviously a good idea.
That is, yeah.
But in this case, they can't do that because you'd have to do the opposite. You'd have to shut all of the shutters and hope that it was still... You couldn't really... It wouldn't work.
It wouldn't work like that, would it? Because with the butchers, I'm guessing the butchers is a smaller shop on the outside.
Yeah.
Not like a big Marks and Spencer's or like a Primark or something where you could... But that's good. That's quick thinking, that she went missing and they put the shutters down, because I don't think I'd have thought of doing that until you've said.
No. And it's logistics. There's probably some rule against shutting people in now. I don't know. So obviously there has been a sign going out on the tannoy, and she did say at that stage it got quite confusing because there were different shops that were reporting having seen him. So she kind of said she was doing like a mad dash where she would run to one shop, realise that James wasn't there, then she'd be going to another shop and they thought they'd got him or seen him, and by this time she's been running around. Security are obviously looking and doing their own investigation, but 40 minutes had then passed, and at that stage the local kind of security said, you know, they've turned up at this point, and there's been no sightings of him, or legitimate sightings of him by the looks of things. She'd again gone and looked at the car parks, and there'd been no sightings.
And it must have been starting to get like a bit darker at this time, because it is obviously February, and we were just saying the other day on the drive to London, it was before 4:00 and it was dark, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So you're going dark at this time and you've got a 2-year-old, like that's even more concerning as well, isn't it?
So at that stage, a policewoman was called. She was on the beat in the local area, knew the shopping centre really well, and she was called out. She was called Mandy Waller.
I thought she was good in this situation. She was... she sort of said,
to have control over the situation.
I know we look at like the golden hour, which is the beginning when someone goes missing, is most like sort of important. But she was like, no, we'll find him. He'll be hiding somewhere. He'll have hidden behind something. We can search all these areas. She sort of knew.
Really strategic.
Yeah, she was strategic. She sort of knew what to do. And I actually thought it was a really clever idea that she put out an alert to the taxi drivers and the bus drivers.
I was just about to say that in part of that strategy, she knew straight away, like, right, how, if he's going to leave the area, how's he going to be able to leave?
Yeah.
Or who is most likely to see him?
And if he's with
Taxi
someone,
drivers, bus drivers.
So they put it out on their systems as well. So the bus drivers have got like not an intercom system.
Yeah.
Is it like, yeah, it is, isn't it, really?
Basically,
and
yeah.
the taxi drivers have got that system. So it's now out on the police radios, on all the taxi driver systems and all the bus driver systems. You're covering a lot of ground there, aren't you?
Yeah,
in
definitely.
general.
So they were then all on the lookout. But this continued, again, no sightings, and 3 hours in, they were then convinced that this was a missing child, a missing persons case, which is obviously a lot on a much greater scale. She said that it became a lot more serious quite quickly.
Yeah.
And again, unfortunately, you don't know at that stage whether it's going to be an abduction.
Yeah.
Because
you've got to think about all these options.
There are car parks nearby, you're on a main street, it would have been easy for an adult to bundle James into a car and drive off quite quickly without anyone necessarily having seen something.
Yeah.
And if no one's seen him wander off or hiding somewhere, then it does make you think it's probably not him on his own hiding.
Yeah.
It's someone else must be involved.
Yeah. And I think nowadays they would have someone looking at like a live CCTV feed going through. But back in the 90s, the CCTV wasn't as advanced as that, which we'll talk about in a bit. But it's not as easy as someone just sat there watching a live feed. No. It will have had to physically be retrieved, which is then going to take longer than 40 minutes. Yeah. So I feel like nowadays this would be probably a lot quicker in terms of technology.
Yeah, you'd like to think, So 4 hours in, at this stage, Merseyside police CID take over the case. And again, this is the phase in which it does get ramped up quite quickly.
I was quite surprised with, like, well, not surprised, but they'd already got, like, the beat officers on the ground. Yeah. They'd got the CID in. They dispatched, like, all of their available officers. Yeah. But then also put up the helicopter
big
as well.
Resource,
So I thought, that is a lot of everyone that was available was actually working on
it because there was a detective inspector on it from 4 hours in. He was a man named Jim I wouldn't say Fitzwilliams, but it wasn't, it was Fitzsimmons, and he said that basically usually it wouldn't have gone so far up the chain of command, however, because they'd sent a helicopter out and an ops support division, which, again, we talk about amount of manpower and resource, that would be 18 police constables, 2 sergeants, and then Jim, who was the inspector. Yeah. And then any officers that they've got available in the Bootle area.
And they've got them driving round as well, looking on the streets and surrounding areas, as well as walking around. Like, again, there's quite a lot of ground that is covered at this point.
Yeah. So 4 hours in, they say, right, the investigation is clearly going to take longer than just us, or James just turning up. Yeah. So they then headed back to the police station. And again, if you watch any interviews with Denise, she talks about how difficult that was, because obviously that's the last place you saw him, you had him, that's your last reference point. So to leave there and go back to the police station, she said, was really difficult because she kind of didn't, she almost felt like she was giving up on him.
Felt like she was leaving him, yeah. And that was really sad, wasn't it? Because it's like, that the police are obviously doing everything they can to help, but you want to be there in case someone does anything. Like, you might show the police a picture of him, but like, him from a distance. You know your son from a distance. Yeah. And
you almost, I would imagine as a parent, you do feel like however many other people are involved, you would be the one to find him.
Yeah.
Because he's yours.
Yeah. I did think, though, that at this stage as well, because the shopping centre was actually due to close, like, everyone's locking up and pulling the shutters down, and you think, what if he's in there? What if he's hiding in one of the shops? And the police actually got the key holders back to the shops to open them up, and they actually went through them one by one.
Again, that's a big feat in itself, a lot of manpower, because there were over 200, again, Inspector Jim, we'll call him. He talked about the fact that there were over 200 key holders. You've got to somehow contact them, whether or not you're getting their mobile numbers or you're going through files from the shop of the staff. Like, that in itself isn't always the easiest process. Then you've got to try and get hold of them. And then they've all then got to head back to the Strand to be able to unlock again, so that the police could then conduct a search shop by shop to categorically say, no, James isn't in here.
Yeah, they had to do them all one by one as well. So they were trying to get the key holders, I think, to come back at a specific time so that they could unlock one shop, do the search, close it up. They could go home, then unlock the other one. So they weren't all unlocked at one time because they thought James might go from one shop into another. And then it's even more confusing, isn't it?
So again, with a lot of these cases, you do have to consider things like that. And I think quite a lot of the time when it's shown on TV, you know, when you see highlights from the news, obviously when you see televised dramas, you don't see that level of strategy that has to be involved because it's just not practical otherwise. So another hour goes by, and at this stage there's then a suspected or reported sighting of James. And the one thing we haven't mentioned yet is, so in Bootle, near this shopping centre, the Strand, it almost backs onto the canal. And so there was a canal path. There's a lot of roads that lead directly by the canal or to the canal. And this sighting was a report of a child crying being seen near the canal. So then officers have to put resource into searching the canal. And then you think, are we, because again, 2-year-old, clumsy, are we wanting to search the water in case he's fallen in, or are we just doing
the sides of the canal where he could be?
Yeah.
And I think you'd, as probably an officer in this case, they'd probably want to be doing both, because if he had fallen in, like, you'd never really sort of forgive yourself if he was in there and you were the one that had said, no, let's just search alongside the canal. So you're in like a catch-22 as an officer, as into like what you would do,
how you go about it. So that search obviously then took hours. And while this is going on, simultaneously, they then are looking through the CCTV. And like we referenced, that's not an easy job by any stretch. The footage itself isn't great. You then do have to get permission from the shops or from the managers or whoever that CCTV footage belongs to. But it was all time lapse. In this time, it was time lapse, and there were 16 different cameras, I think, that they'd managed to get CCTV footage from.
And it wasn't a video like we know it as now. It had taken a photograph, something like every 3 seconds, didn't it? So you could see on the CCTV, it'd like be a photograph, and then it was like a jump and they'd move. And you could sort of trace someone, but you couldn't see exactly where they were walking. It was like every 3 seconds you'd see a person move.
And again, there's quite a lot of nuance in people's behaviour, isn't there? And you don't get that from an every 3 second clip. I might like point at you and shout, that's not captured. A second later I lower my hand, next minute we've walked off together. That might look, because you've not got this, like you've come with me and we're just having a nice chat. But actually, if that had been captured, that looks more threatening. So it's things like that. It's the detail that you are missing, which can be really significant. But I think what we're about to say next shows, again, just the speed or the rate in which these things can just take place. We mentioned that it was just opportunistic. And how quickly these things happened. Denise literally let go of her son's hand for a split second to get her purse. And in this case, they quickly saw that within 1 minute, 30 seconds, that's all it took for James to be abducted.
Yeah. And not even just for him to be abducted, to be taken and physically led out of the shopping centre in that amount of time. So in that space of time, you've got Denise and you've got other people probably around her that are helping her look.
Yeah.
You're looking in the shop that you're in, you're looking in the next shop, you're looking in a vicinity which is close to you.
Yeah.
Not knowing that at that time, he'd already been led away from his mom.
So the footage showed or depicted James being taken away by two youths. And again, this was strange within itself because as far as they know, it's not like James had any older like family members or they didn't have any family friends that would have taken him. But it was two youths that were shown. And again, they are seen walking hand in hand with James, leading him out of the shopping centre. Yeah. Out towards the canal bridge. So again, it's like, is this sighting legitimate? But they didn't mention the two youths.
I don't like it when they say youths because you think, how old? How old are they? Like,
I know.
Give an estimation of like an age. A youth to me could be anything from like, I don't know, small to like 15-year-olds or something.
Yeah, I'd think like 13 to like 19, maybe. But that's still really vague.
At this stage as well, I feel like there must have been a slight amount of relief here because James had not been injured, he'd not been taken by an adult, which could have been, you know, the police didn't know if he'd have gone with an adult, what could have happened. Yeah. So it seemed a little bit like a safer option that he was with children. Yeah, almost.
And even the chief inspector said that when they said that it was like two boys, effectively, two young boys taking him away, there was a bit of a sigh of relief because like generally if it's an adult based on previous, we know that is going to either that's going to be negative in some, whether or not they are going to try and abduct James and hold him, whether or not they're going to try and abduct James and then pass him along to someone else. Yeah, none of those outcomes are good. Youths, you'd be kind of thinking maybe they're doing a prank.
Maybe they're messing around. Maybe someone's dead.
Maybe they've convinced this kid to go and nick something from a shop for them. You're not thinking it's going to be...
You're not thinking the worst, are you, when you see that? So I do think that little bit of relief that they probably thought then was like, we do need to find out, obviously, who these people are, but I think they thought there was a good chance that things would end okay after that.
So, again, we'll talk kind of simultaneously and then we'll flip back to the CCTV. While this is going on, and obviously that's a painstaking process, 17 hours have now gone by, and at this stage there's a press officer that's involved. And we've talked about how the press can be a hindrance and a help in this time. Again, 1993, there was still things like Crime Watch and people were quite invested in helping. So going through that CCTV footage is obviously a painstaking process in itself. But while this is still going on, the following morning, so that's the Saturday morning, about 17 hours now into the investigation, there's a press officer that's involved, and she's called Diane Halliwell, and she is asked to fax all the press outlets and inform them that there is a press release about a missing person, but then actually that there is going to be a press conference. And they don't seem as prevalent now, really, press conferences.
No, I think it's because you can just get things out on social media really quick, but back then there weren't stuff like that, was there?
Yeah, so this press conference was going to be one in which Denise Bulger and Ralph, her husband, both would then give a statement, effectively either appealing to the two boys and just appealing for information, basically. So the severity of the case is still unknown, but if you're holding a press conference, it's a pretty...
People were sort of starting to realise at this point how serious this was in general. Yeah. And it wasn't just maybe a little boy that had gone missing and was going to come back and turn up. There was more to it.
Yeah, and the other key part of this press conference was that they were wanting to get the word out there that they were specifically looking for two boys They did show CCTV images in that, but
They
again, it's
weren't
really
clear, were they?
grainy. I wouldn't have even probably been able to say that that was James.
No, I that's exactly what I thought. Like now, we would get quite a clear image, but as well, it wasn't even the front, was it? It was
No,
like sort of a
just
weird
the backs
angle
of
as
them.
well.
Yeah.
But
They were looking for 2 boys, both white teenagers, and all they said in terms of detail was that one was wearing a leather jacket.
yeah,
So again, they're still analysing the CCTV to try and get whatever information they can in terms of more information. But while all this is going on, they are still doing a comprehensive search of the canal, the general area, drains,
yeah,
grates. And I don't know whether you saw, there was a picture of like, it almost looked like it was under a viaduct bridge, probably
Yeah.
near the canal. But it was just a mound, a great mound of like, what I only assume is like litter and debris. And I thought, if you were trying to go through that,
imagine having
it
to
would
search
just,
through all
that
that as
in
well.
itself would probably take a day to go through. So
Yeah.
it just seems like such a mammoth task.
I think, though, in this case, when the CCTV images were released, even though we've said they're quite bad quality, they said calls just started coming in from all over the place. Like, I was surprised at how many calls came in from releasing such grainy CCTV image. But again, then they're looking at, there's such a wide area to search at this point now, isn't there? Because you're thinking, well, from the shopping centre, 17 hours, where could he have got to from there?
Yeah.
So you'd start at the shopping centre, but you're working outwards, aren't you? And 17 hours now is a long time.
It's a very long time, yeah. So we're now, we'll skip to 39 hours later. This is now on the Sunday. And on the Sunday, again, they're checking all the wasteland. There was quite a lot of kind of council estates, but then with quite a lot of wasteland or green areas out the back towards the canal. So they were asking locals to check gardens and sheds and things like that. And one woman said that she had seen 2 youths walking along with a younger boy. But that sighting was over a mile away. So, like you say, this search area is huge now.
But that was also the day before as well. And I think, like, obviously she waited for police to come and ask her about it, but I don't know if, like, with it being on
they
TV
could have got
and
anywhere
stuff,
by then.
It's I know it's like a day late, but like we said, it's not like now where you're on social media and you ring straight up and you get it out to everyone.
No.
It's like, have they watched that programme? Have they watched the appeal on TV? Have they even read the newspapers?
Yeah.
Because if you hadn't and you'd just seen 2 boys with a younger boy, you might not think anything of
No.
it.
Well, you
in
wouldn't
particular,
really,
unless
would you?
you'd seen,
Yeah. So, while, again, this is going on, Denise and Mandy, who, again, was this kind of patrol officer that was there right from the very beginning, she was kind of looking after Denise, wasn't she? She was there. Seems like she became almost like the family liaison.
That's what I thought,
Yeah. And she'd said, right, okay, Denise was going out of her mind at this point. She kept saying that she'd thought she'd seen something and whatever. So she was like, look, we'll go around the local area, and if you want to just stay in the car and we'll just have a look so that you feel like you're doing something.
Just
feel
drive
like
round, yeah.
And so while they were doing that, Mandy did actually receive a call from the police station which asked them both to return to the station. And Denise recalls that and says that she just knew straight from the off.
She knew something was wrong, yeah.
And she'd actually said to Mandy, like, what is it? Have they found him? And Mandy said, they've genuinely not told me. I don't know, but we just need to get back to the police station. And the reason that they'd got called back is because that there had at that stage then been reports, again, by children. It was 4 schoolboys that were just mucking around on their way back from school, and they'd come across something and believed that they'd found the body of James Bulger.
So I actually saw the CCTV of the little boys, the kids,
yeah.
and they'd interviewed.
I know.
They were on camera, and they were saying, "Oh, what did you find?"
But
and he's
not
like,
just not interviewed in terms of the police, like literally press. Were like, so how was it?
Yeah, what did you find? And he's like, "Oh, well, I was just playing, and we were messing around on the train tracks, and we found a body."
Yeah,
and it was so matter of fact. And I think did they actually get any help
support
for that?
Yeah,
because I read into it, and one of the boys that actually found James's body, I think he died later on. I'm sure they said he died in police custody. So you never know if that was the catalyst that had
then
messed him up.
Led him to spiral. Yeah. So it was these four school children, and obviously police are then called. But that in itself was 2 miles away from where James had actually gone missing. And it was along a railway line. So if you think about it, it took 1 minute 30 for these two boys to lead James away. But then James's body, and it was confirmed to be James's body, was found 2 miles away.
And getting a 2-year-old 2 miles away.
Yeah, these youths aren't going to be driving a car. They've not bundled him into a car. So it was, again, really perplexing even for the team that were working on it. It was Walton Lane that they actually attended in terms of the scene. And Jim Fitzsimmons, again, the chief inspector, said that quite clearly, as soon as he saw James's body, it was intentional and there were just devastating injuries. And that was just upon kind of first inspection before you've even done any investigation.
And it was multiple injuries as well, so it couldn't have been like, in first instance, you might think, oh, he's fell. No. And it's been an accident. It was obvious, they said to the officers, that something actually horrific had happened.
And that would stay with the officers, you know, that goes without saying, but it was actually James's uncle that agreed to identify James's body for the family. And again, Jim, the inspector, said that he came out a completely broken man. The uncle just, obviously after seeing something like that,
thought maybe he'd be able to do it. And you think he's probably thinking, oh, I'm helping Denise out because you don't want the mom to see the son in that way.
Or Ralph.
But then for that just to totally change his life as well. And the police at this point are now wanting to sort of identify and look into any children in the local area that have been involved in any violence. Yeah. Because at this point, James has only been seen with these two youths.
Yeah, and they were effectively like, yes, they've dragged him away, but probably like, well, I say dragged, they just looked like he was leaving.
Yeah.
So, yes, they were probably persons of interest, and they would have been suspects to a degree, but now you're looking at them as suspects of a murder.
Yeah.
And so the investigation then becomes a murder case. And quite quickly, within day 2, they are investigating a serious murder and all hands on deck. They talk about the Monday morning was mentioned when they basically said that they needed to filter through all the media inquiries because they were coming in 10 to a dozen, but then also be really strategic about how they were going to find these two youths.
Yeah, and the police actually looked through their system, didn't they? And, you know, looked for anyone who could be a possible suspect in this case. Yeah. And I think over 60 of the boys that flashed up as a potential were brought in and questioned by the police and by the detectives.
Yeah, if they'd
anyone that flagged up.
Yeah, if they'd got anything like from antisocial behaviour or maybe being kicked out of school, that
or
kind
anything
of thing.
to violence that would, you know, sort of could have escalated to this. The police brought 60 boys in the area, all young boys as well being brought in, and tips were being followed by detectives. Like, they were looking into sort of everything they possibly could. They also got the media at this point to help them with getting the CCTV images out. So they sort of like, in a way, teamed up with the media to push the images more and more.
And they also now wanted more images because, yes, they've got that initial abduction, but we now know that they took James over a 2-mile distance. So they actually reached out to local businesses along the route that they believed that they'd travelled, which was along the canal path for a lot of the time. And they did actually find that a local business had captured them over the other side of the road, leading James along. And that became really significant because there was a small kind of wall that they'd walked past. And the police, again, you've got to have a really clever brain.
I thought this was good to think of this.
Because they said, right, okay, let's measure, because they weren't really sure about the age of the boys. They'd initially said between 12 and 15, But then they said, right, if we measure this wall, we know, generally speaking, how tall you are at whatever age. And they then realised that based on how tall the boys were in comparison to the wall, which wasn't that much taller than it, must have meant that they actually weren't as old as they'd initially believed.
So they thought originally they were looking maybe at 13 to 15-year-olds, but after doing this comparison to the wall and what James was in comparison to the wall, they actually started looking now for boys that were around 10 to 12 years old. So it's quite a big difference, isn't it?
Yeah.
In the height. And they did look quite young on this CCTV, didn't they?
Yeah,
you know,
they did.
compared to in the supermarket, in the shopping centre,
centre.
you couldn't really get a feel. I don't think you could sort of see they were kids, but you couldn't put a
you couldn't
height
gauge
on
it,
it or
no.
anything. But now with the wall, they've got a reference point, and now they've lowered the search to 10 years old.
Two boys at 10
10 years
taking
old,
a 2-year-old. It's just
It doesn't even sound real.
No. So by day 4, they had a really significant lead come through. Obviously, we now know more about the suspects, but it was actually an officer... someone came in to Walton Lane police station and was in a bit of a state of distress, said that they'd got information about the James Bulger disappearance and murder, and said that they were at a family friend's house. They knew the family really well, but they had a son, the friends had a son, and the son had basically come home as if nothing was wrong, but said that he'd skipped school, he'd bunked off. He was only 10, so that would fit what we now know about the average age, and that he looked a bit dishevelled in terms of his clothing.
They said he'd got like red paint on him, didn't they? He was covered in sort of like a red paint. And I don't know if it was that unusual for him to come home a mess, because they didn't seem to, the parents didn't seem to be too alarmed, did they?
And if you've bunked school, they probably have been
digging
mucking about. But she said that it could have been him in the CCTV footage. And by him, she was actually referencing a child called John Venables.
Yeah.
And John Venables was at St Mary's School, which was in Bedford, again, local. And when the police did some digging, the head teacher had actually said that John Venables hadn't attended. It was confirmed that he had skipped school that day, and that he'd actually skipped school with another child of the same age, Robert Thompson. And again, that family was well known and lived close to, unfortunately, where James's body was found.
Yeah, so at this point, the police have got 2 of their main suspects, and probably their only suspects to go by, really. In this case, there wasn't a lot that had...
No, they've interviewed a lot
else, was there?
No, they've interviewed a lot of young boys, but they've not had any other leads.
On Thursday, the 18th of February, this is when the police decided to dispatch officers to arrest Venables and Thompson, but they had to have 2 separate teams, obviously, to go to both each of their houses. So they'd got the home addresses from the head teacher at school. So they went to John Venables first. He wasn't there.
It was
they'd
actually
been given his father's address, and he was actually at his mother's house. So they found out where his mother's house was and went out to arrest him there. And then in the meantime, a team was also sent out to arrest Thompson. They were also taken to separate police stations to be interviewed. So not even the same one in a different room. And the police at this point said they sort of knew they'd got the boys that had abducted abducted James.
So they were arrested first thing in the morning, like about 7 o'clock in the morning. And as soon as they were arrested, interestingly, both boys were told to get the clothes that they were wearing when they'd bunked off school, which again I think was good. I think John Venables' mother was all right about it. She didn't kick off and say, "You're not speaking to my child." She was like, "Okay, yes, let's go in and you're going to talk to the police and tell them." But interestingly, straight when they were at John Venables' house and said that he needed to be questioned, he said, "Well, are you going to interview Bobby?" So they knew from the off that there was a connection between these two boys.
Yeah.
And although both of them denied initially ever having been at the Strand shopping centre, they were continually interviewed, obviously with breaks, but they were interviewed until about 5 p.m. So they had a whole day of questioning.
Yeah.
Again, John Venables initially said that he wasn't even there and never had abducted James. But straight from the off, we start to see differences in their accounts.
I feel like Thompson was the one that had started talking a lot sooner, whereas John had denied it, but there was proof that the boys had actually been at the shopping centre. So originally, when they first come in, they'd both denied it, and the police had looked into the reports, and there was a man who had, I think it was the betting shop, out on the outside of the shopping centre that we mentioned earlier, and it was all glass on the front, and he'd reported 2 boys being stood in front of the glass bit and putting their hands all over the windows, like mucking about, touching the windows. So the police went straight down there and fingerprinted outside the betting shop on the windows, and they probably wouldn't have been cleaned in that amount of time on the outside, and they managed to lift fingerprints from that window to prove that they'd been there at some point.
Yeah, for anyone that's maybe been on, well, had the pleasure of us in school or college or whatever, that would be aluminium powder they would have used. So yes, so they've now got proof, and Robert Thompson, Bobby, as he was kind of known, had then said, yeah, all right, well, we saw James with his mum in the shopping centre, but we didn't do anything.
Yeah.
Then they changed their tactics in terms of interviewing when they'd got this proof.
Because now we need...
I think it was a building society, actually. I think they were next to each other.
The betting shop and the building society, when we talk about interviewing children, though, I think it was only yesterday we spoke about this in school, wasn't it? You need a specialist team to actually interview children. It's a different process to if you're interviewing an adult. And the police officer in this case, the person interviewing had said you almost had to build up some sort of relationship and rapport with the boys to make them trust you to then tell you what had happened.
And they've obviously got the person, it can be a family member or there's a word.
Like a guardian?
There's a person that you have in the room when you're a child, and I can't remember it now. Anyway, I did think, listening to the clips of the interviews, that they did interview the boys really well.
They did, yeah.
They were like friendly, but not over friendly.
Yeah.
They knew that they were there for a specific reason, and they kept bringing the boys back to the point, because again, with children, you're likely to go off piste, but they kept saying, on a tangent. This is why we're here, and this is what we want you to talk about.
I thought, though, that Thompson wasn't particularly scared in his interviews. Like, I feel like John Venables was acted a little bit more scared, but Robert Thompson just seemed to be not too...
Yeah, but then later on in his interview, it was actually him, it was Robert Thompson that kept just crying. Any time he felt like he was getting blamed, he would then cry, and
is that manipulative?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, that's not because he's scared and he's upset. That's because he's trying to manipulate the police.
Yeah, he didn't seem scared. He just seemed like any time the heat was on him, he would cry.
But the police said, didn't they had a hard time believing that these 2 little boys that were sat in front of them could have committed this.
Because
again, it's a hard thing to get your head round.
And in that environment, they would look even smaller, because you'd have the appropriate adult, I've remembered.
Appropriate adult,
You'd have the appropriate adult, you'd have your mum or whatever, you'd then have probably 2 detectives.
Yeah.
You might have someone overseeing it because it's children.
I'd be scared
So if you imagine a small room,
if I got interviewed.
Intimidating, and they didn't seem massively intimidated. But Bobby did keep saying, Robert Thompson did keep saying, I'm getting all the blame, you're giving me all the blame. And it seemed like he was implying that it was all John Venables' idea.
Yeah.
So ultimately, both boys did admit that they'd been at the shopping centre at the Strand and that they'd seen James, but didn't say that they knew anything about the abduction or the the killing. But
Yeah.
quite quickly this unravelled.
It must have took quite a lot of time. I bet the officers just felt like they were going round in circles for a little bit, because they were just like, at first they were denying it, and then they said they'd never been to a shopping centre. Then when the police said, well, we know you've been at the shopping centre, they said, oh, well, I did go, but I didn't see James. Then they said, oh, we did see James and his mum, but we didn't go near him. And then it escalated again, and they said, oh, yeah, well, we held his hand and we were walking with him, but we didn't take him, we didn't do anything.
Yeah.
It was sort of like, it was every time they said something, a little bit of something was getting added on.
Yeah.
And I think they had like a breakthrough moment where the detective actually says, whose idea was it to walk towards him?
Yeah.
And Venables says, mine, but it was Robert's idea to kill him. And when they said that, it just sent chills. Like, you're 10 years old. How are they even thinking about that at the time?
Because at one point, Robert Thompson was basically like, well, we were going to get a boy and we were just going to push him over.
Yeah.
And you think, but like, even like that, like pulling him away, it just all was very odd. And then ultimately it did get really dark, because in some of these interviews, at one stage they're saying like, why did you take the baby? Like, to Robert Thompson, they're like, why did you take him? And he says, if I wanted to kill a baby, I'd kill my own, wouldn't I?
So he must have had a little brother or sister or something.
And you just think, what kind of 10-year-old is coming out with these things? It was all very sinister.
Yeah.
And again, when they had then admitted to taking James, and they did admit to repeatedly pushing him down on the canal, but that he'd kept getting up again and that he'd got a bump on his head, Robert Thompson did an impression
of
James.
That was
in
horrible.
Like a baby voice saying,
I want my mum.
Like, I want my mummy, please stop. And and you just think like, but again, the way that he flipped at 10 years old and did that impression, you just think it's just so...
I actually, when I watched the interviews and I was watching this part of it, when he said that, I literally paused the TV and was like, what?
Yeah.
Actual hell was that? It's very disturbing watching the interviews, because you also can hear on the interviews that these boys are so young and it's just like a child talking.
Yeah.
But when they're talking about what they've done
actually
and things
they
like
did, yeah. Because at one point as well, with I think it was Robert Thompson, he was basically like crying and saying that you're blaming me, and they stopped the interview and said to his mum, will you have a word with him and say, like, and make sure he knows that he needs to tell us the truth? And
to be fair, she did, didn't she?
And she did.
Yeah.
She said, you need to tell them everything. We still love you, but you need to tell the truth. And at that point, it kind of the floodgates open, and they started telling as close. They said by interview 6 was when, and this is like day 5 of the investigation now, is when they thought they were getting as close as they were probably going to get to the actual truth.
Yeah, because the police wanted to find out how James had got all these separate injuries.
Yeah.
And they knew what injuries James had. And so they knew if, obviously, these two boys would be telling the truth, because they could relate them to the injuries. Like at one point they said, well, because he fell over or we pushed him over on the canal, that's how he had the bump on his head.
Yes.
But obviously it wasn't just a bump on his head when they found him.
No.
So how did it escalate to all the rest of the...
So John Venables said that they were initially just going to push him into the canal. They kept pushing him down. That's how he got a bump on his head. But then they didn't really know what to do next. And again, you think at that point, like, kids get bored easily. Surely you'd have just then left him and carried on. But they didn't. This was a prolonged attack. And they then decided to walk up towards Walton Village, which again was near where Robert lived, so it was a familiar area to the boys. So they decided to walk up there, but walk James along the train tracks. And that stage, again, they talk quite flippantly about how they decided to throw bricks at James, the 2-year-old boy. But both, again, placed blame on each other. So at that point, Venables was saying that it was all Thompson and it was his idea and that he'd thrown a brick nearby but not directly at him. But at that stage, they'd got enough to charge both boys with murder.
Yeah.
And they then became the two youngest offenders in the previous 100 years to be charged with such an offence.
So it actually happened quite quick, because when they were charged, it was the 20th of Feb.
Yeah.
So it's not like a lot of time a lot of stuff has gone on in between, but it's not like a lot of time has elapsed. So I thought this was quite a quick one.
So they were charged and taken to Sefton Magistrates Court.
Yep.
That was on the 22nd that they were taken to the court. And Venables was there with his father. And Thompson had a social worker with him at that stage. Both were denied bail, rightly so.
Yep.
And they were then remanded in a youth detention centre.
Did you see what happened, like, outside the court? How many people were there?
Yeah.
And how many people were trying to get to, like, the children?
Yeah,
and
outrage.
It was pure outrage outside that courtroom.
And you do
think,
I mean, you don't know what happened in the children's lives beforehand, but you think, like, their families, like John Venables and Robert Thompson's families must have been in danger, because people do just want someone to blame.
We already know that Robert had a little brother or sister.
Yeah.
So, like, what would it be like for them well? Yeah.
Yeah. So, again, we'll just kind of quickly give you an outline of what happened next. So, that was within 2 weeks of the initial abduction. By March, so that was February, so a month later, then, unfortunately, Denise had to organise the funeral of James, and it was a huge event.
People lined the streets.
There were so many
people,
even in the church itself. I mean, it looked like it would have been a beautiful service. The armchair that was made by Ralph, his dad, really got to me. They'd kind of made it for when he was growing up.
For me, it was when they got the little white coffin out.
Yeah.
And it was like the
tiny.
Big, yeah.
Yeah. So that was ongoing, but by the 1st of November, that's when the trial started. And the trial actually went to Preston Crown Court, which was now 9 months after the murder.
And put into perspective, both boys were still only 11 at this time.
Yeah.
Like 2 11-year-olds on trial. And when they came into the courtroom, people were saying, like, how small and just little they were in general.
And apparently at that stage, both boys were really scared of going to court and all the people. But then it's like, well, you know, you knew that you were quite conscious of committing violent offences at the time. Yeah. So why would you not be conscious of the repercussions? But
and
again,
in this case, the prosecution actually called 38 witnesses.
Yeah, that's what I found.
Because I was shocked how many people had seen the 3 boys together along the way. Yeah. And some people had questioned it, and they'd said, oh, this is my little brother, or we're just taking him somewhere, or we're doing... Like, there was quite a lot of people that had actually witnessed it along the way, and that must have been horrible for them as well now. Thinking... could I have done... That's what I would think. Could I have done more at the time? Should I have done this? But
again, you don't expect 2 10-year-old boys to be lying about something like that. No. And I think that's, for me, when I thought that those 2 10-year-old boys were different to the norm. Yeah. Because you don't often get children that get called out on a lie and then continue to be so... sociopathic about it. You know, generally if you call kids out, they'll either get silly and defensive and you can tell straight away, or they'll just give up on the lie straight away. These 2 boys
carried on,
had over a period of 2.5 miles repeatedly been questioned about what they were doing, and then continued to do it anyway, and continued to escalate the violence. So to me, watching it, it did feel calculated at that point. Like, they knew what they were doing, and they continued to
carry
escalate.
On. So the forensic evidence was presented to the jury, and it was found that James had suffered 42 separate injuries, and the cause of death was multiple head injuries.
Over 30 head injuries.
It was a prolonged and violent attack. And like we said, we're not going into all the injuries, but...
Yeah, so they had used different objects. Again, it was opportunistic, so it was stones, bricks and metal found along the railway line. But again, that shows repeated aggression.
Yeah.
And it's just purpose, isn't it? There's no mistake in there.
No.
In fact, both boys had referenced, which again, obviously the interviews would have been used in the court process, but they'd both referenced that he just kept getting back up. This poor little 2-year-old boy kept getting back up. And for them to not then at that stage think, no, I've gone too far, shows that there was a level of...
Yeah. Did you see the evidence where... So Thompson was denying ever being involved in this, and forensics have actually got a... could tell that he was involved because of the D-ring on his shoe. So it's where the lace goes through from the imprint on a mark to his actual shoe. Yeah. So they knew that he'd had some involvement because it matched. And I was like, that is a really good piece of evidence, because there's no doubt then that Thompson had an involvement. Yeah.
And not only, that's not like fibres where they could have come into contact. Yeah. That's within the
solid
violent
evidence.
Offence, isn't it? That's at the time of the violence occurring.
Yeah, so if we move on to the sentence, they were both found guilty for the abduction and the murder of James.
2 11-year-old boys.
Yeah, and the judge in this case did actually decide to release the names throughout the case. They were child A and child B, but their names were then released to the public. Yeah. And the judge said at the end, you will serve many, many years in jail. So at this point, everyone's thinking, well, they're going to get so
the sentence
long
will be heavy,
but the sentence, they were originally sentenced to 8 years. I know the children, but that is, to me, that doesn't sound like it is a lot. They would still be teenagers when they would be released in this case, which is ridiculous.
Yeah. And for me, a child committing murder, you know, there have been cases in the past where they've pushed the child too far, or this so calculated and so well thought through for 2 10-year-olds that you think they're well aware they should have a longer sentence.
And I think obviously Denise and Ralph felt that this sentence wasn't enough, so they actually decided to start a petition.
Yeah. And it was Lord Chief Justice. What a title.
Yes, Lord Chief Justice. Yeah. But then it actually came down to the decision of the Home Secretary at the time. So it was Michael Howard. Yeah. And he said that he looked and he said, right, if they were tried as adults, what would they get? And then, because they are children, they were sentenced to 8 years. So he went for sort of something in between. So he said, in this case, I'll go 15 years, and then they will spend some of their time in, obviously, a juvenile facility. Yeah. But then they will also spend time in an actual prison, which he thought that is the only justice that the family is going to get if these people go to an adult
facility,
not just a juvenile.
But then the sentence was appealed again, because basically people were saying that all of the press about how horrific it was had basically swayed the decision. So it then had to go back to Lord Chief Justice, and so the final sentence was 7 years and 8 months. So it went from 8 years to 10 years to 15 years,
and then back to
under
7
years and 8 months.
So because they were so young, they didn't even spend time in a prison. It was in a secure children's home. So they never went to young offenders and they never went to prison.
And I don't know whether you saw, but so they both went to separate places. So Robert Thompson was sent to Barton Moss Secure Children's Home, and John Venables was sent to Red Bank in Merseyside, which was 12 miles away. But I don't know whether you saw the photos of these units. We've been into secure mental health units before for work. Yeah. And I mean, it didn't look there weren't as many display boards as those, but this looked very similar
to what we'd worked
in terms of just a corridor with rooms off it. And yes, you can see that there's locks on the doors, but it didn't look like a negative place to be. It didn't look like a prison where they kind of keep it to the basics, because that's what you are. You're there to be punished.
Yeah, it was a children's home. Yeah, like in theory, it wasn't anything different, was it?
No,
That's the hard thing. And in June 2001, they were both released on life license, but they got different identities. They got lifelong anonymity.
Yeah.
And they were just 18 when they were released.
Yeah, and despite the fact that obviously they had to have daily reports while they're in these units, and John Venables, it was literally reported, that he was still making incredibly violent statements which were involving children.
Oh, to the police, to
the like therapists and to the workers within the unit.
Yeah,
so despite
he'd made a joke, hadn't he?
Yeah.
About
So
killing
despite
someone.
them being multiple references within these daily reports, they were still then freed and given new identities by 2001.
So in terms of Robert Thompson and John Venables, from what we know to this day, listening to the interviews from the child interviews that they did, I always thought I was leaning more towards Robert Thompson being one who was more switched on, one who was more streetwise, and maybe, like, obviously I know it was a decision that they both did, but maybe he could have been more in control.
Yeah.
But Robert Thompson, since his release, has not been recalled to prison.
It was interesting because I thought that it was probably John Venables' idea.
Yeah.
But I thought that Robert Thompson sent better at being able to like
Carry
cover
it
their
out.
tracks
Yeah.
almost. He sent like the more of the brains.
But then now it's Robert Thompson that didn't commit any further offences when he was released
Or he's
at
not
18.
been caught for any.
And I read that he was in a relationship with a male who knew his true identity. Whereas John Venables, on the other hand, has been recalled to prison multiple times. In 2010, he was sentenced to 2 years for making and distributing indecent images of children.
57
And then in
images.
2017, he was arrested again and sentenced to over 3 years for downloading over 1,000 images of child sex abuse. And in 2020, he was denied parole because they said he still didn't think he was safe to be let out, which I think is absolutely the correct decision.
Yeah.
But in 2010, Denise and her new husband, Stuart, they had kids together as well. And they were talking about sort of their home life without James, but sort of remembering him. They set up a charity in James's name. They started with like a caravan, and then they upgraded it to like a static caravan.
Yeah.
And they now help out families whose, kids are going through a rough time or maybe being bullied or, have got problems. And they give them like
support,
a holiday.
isn't it? It's like
not a holiday. But it's
respite
sort of
almost. Yeah.
Respite. If the children have been like disadvantaged by bereavement, if they've been victims of crime themselves, which I thought was actually really
incredible.
nice. So if you want to get involved in anything to do with that, we will leave the website in the show notes, and you can actually nominate someone. You can donate or volunteer by visiting the website, which we will put in.
Yeah. So I think Denise has done an incredible job of staying strong.
Yeah.
Securing that family unit that she's got now, remembering her son.
I think it was another 2 sons that she went on to have, and they were talking about Christmas, how, they always talk about James. They always, because they were young when one of them was the one in the sailor suit in the photographs. And they do have a bit of a joke about that in one of the documentaries.
One of Denise's sons is actually, or at the time that he was interviewed, was having a child of themselves.
Yeah.
So I think, thankfully, in some ways, life does go on, and Denise now has that unit, and she will be able to probably seek comfort in that. But ultimately, the life of James Bulger was absolutely obliterated.
Way too soon.
Too soon.
It's awful.
And when you think, I referenced right at the beginning about the amount of people's lives that would have been changed in this case, you think of Denise's family, especially the uncle.
Yeah.
You think of the detective in this case, Mandy,
the dad, James's dad,
the press officer, Ralph.
Because you don't hear as much about him throughout this. I think I don't want to say took a backseat. He kept a little bit more out of the limelight, I think.
But it's just, really difficult, and hopefully James's name will always be remembered, especially through the charity that Denise set up.
Yep.
So that's another case for you. We are back next week, I swear. And that will be another case study as well, which is one that's actually been suggested to us by a listener. So that's very exciting.
Yep.
And, well, in the meantime, take care.
Bye.